Hello, this is the Redaction Politics podcast. I'm Declan Carey, and today I'm joined by James Moules, our contributing editor, and our reporters Richard Hansen and Mason Quah. How are we doing, guys?
Yeah, good, mate.
Just about recovered after that lengthy live stream.
Yeah, gosh, we did it, didn't we? We hit our target for our live
stream. We did. Yes, thanks very much, everyone, once again for tuning in and chipping in. We did meet our fundraising target for Safe Passage UK, which was really, really generous of you. So thanks very much.
Absolutely, and apologies for not being able to be present. My now 12-day-old baby decided to come 2 weeks early, so I had my hands full in other ways.
Well, many congratulations, Richard.
Thanks, but it was a small one of the few things that I was thinking, damn, I wish I could have been a part of it. But I'm glad it went well all the same.
Yeah. I mean, we've got a big topic today. There's been a big story in the news, which everybody's been following, which is the US election, of course. Many or most outlets have now called it for Joe Biden. I've checked the New York Times earlier today, and they've called it, saying that he'll get 306 electoral votes. That's calling it for the state of Georgia in Joe Biden's favor. It looks like then, if these results are going to turn out to be correct, it looks like Biden's flipped Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, lots of key battleground states. First of all, what are your reactions to the results? What do we make of Biden's win over Trump?
Just firstly that it was expected, and despite the fact that on Tuesday night into Wednesday morning, pretty much all of liberal left-leaning Twitter sort of collectively melted down when Trump was called. It was Trump when Trump won Florida and was ahead in a number of key battleground states. We spoke about it on this podcast that a lot of the election day returns are going to favor Trump, and then Biden is going to come roaring back over the next few days in the key places like Pennsylvania, like Georgia, like Arizona, and in Wisconsin and Michigan. So it was kind of as expected. I mean, obviously the polls were slightly out, but again, it went to show that the polls could be out and Biden would still comfortably win. It was definitely a nice moment to see it called on. What was it, Saturday afternoon, our time here.
I think that is a point to be made, is that a lot of people are framing this now as a sort of very comfortable win for Biden, which I'm not convinced it is. Okay. By the mechanics of the US electoral system. Obviously, if it were a just system, in my view, in which it's just a simple matter of who gets the most votes wins, obviously Biden would have won by a fair amount. But let's bear in mind, in a few key swing states which swung it to Biden, they were some pretty close contests, often within a percentage point of each other. So I think, bearing in mind that context, this was a close election, and far closer than it should have been.
I think it's always going to be a close election, given the polarized nature of the US electorate. But then, you've got to play the system which is in front of you. I mean, I think it's important to remember, Biden has received 78 million votes in the popular vote. I think he's leading Donald Trump by more than 5 million votes.
Which is a record, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. He's received more votes than Obama did in 2008. And I think as well, you've mentioned it, James, a lot on some of the other podcasts, that he just needed to flip a certain amount of votes in a certain amount of key states. Donald Trump, if it wasn't for 30,000 votes across 3 states, Donald Trump wouldn't have won in 2016.
Well, it was slightly more than 30,000, wasn't it? But
not a significant amount of votes.
Absolutely.
But I do think, though, I do think we need to look at the flip side of, the records that's been shattered. Biden got more votes than any US president in history. Donald Trump got the second most. We can't rely on the idea of getting, world record breaking turnout every 4 years. It's just not possible to keep that political momentum alive.
Absolutely, and Donald Trump did do a good job, especially in the closing stages of the campaign, at turning out his own base. His own base was smaller than Biden's, of course, so there was only a certain amount of people that he could turn out. But he did do a good job at turning them out and making this a closer race. I mean, we talked about, there was a poll, 10 or so days before the election, which had Biden up 17 in Wisconsin. 17! And he carried the state by what, a point? Less than a point?
I think it was less than a point. I'll just triple check while we're here.
So I think we do need to talk about accuracy of the polls. I mean, the polls were wrong, quite wrong, in a number of key battleground states, but then again, they were quite correct in a number of others. They were pretty correct in Georgia. I think I owe you a beer, James. They were pretty correct in Arizona.
I'll claim that when I'm next up north.
Indeed, and they were within the margin of error in Florida. It was just in the Midwest that the pollsters seem to miss by quite a substantial margin, I think.
Yeah, here we have it. Joe Biden. This is Associated Press. Joe Biden 49.6% in Wisconsin. Trump 48.9%. That's less than a point's difference.
0.7%. So you're already almost into recount territory there. And I mean, having polls that are out, we had him almost 20 points ahead. Come on now. We need to start talking about ways where we can perhaps accurately measure the mood of the country before an election moving forward.
Just a question I have for everyone.
How close some of those races are does remind us that we need to be incredibly grateful to our allies and comrades in the Libertarian Party, who managed to lose several key swing states for the Republicans.
Absolutely, yeah. But I mean, here's a question I have for everyone here. Interested to hear what all your takes are on this. Was this Biden's win or Trump's loss?
I think it was Trump's loss, in my opinion, because there was a lot of ticket splitting that went on. I think, and this is probably not going to be a very popular opinion on this podcast, but I think the American people did largely reject the ideas of the far left, and what they said is, well, we don't like Trump, and we want to get rid of him. So, and we're happy with Biden, but they did pretty well in the Senate, and they did pretty well in the House. I mean, there's every chance that they're going to have the majority in the Senate still, the Republicans, I mean. So I think in some ways it was Trump's loss, but the Republican Party's gain.
I mean, I don't disagree that a majority of the American people are probably not on board with, I mean, depending on where you're drawing the lines there, far left politics for sure.
So when I say far left, I mean an American version of far left, which would include things like socialized medicine, which we here in the UK take for granted.
Yeah, we do need to include the fact that Trump got a greater swath of the minority vote than he got 4 years ago. Notably, he got a large amount of Latin American and Cuban voters.
Delivered in Florida.
Yeah, and that's because they were scared of the big S word, the spooky, scary socialist Biden.
They
He's
were
coming to take your toothbrush.
I mean, it is an interesting point that a lot of people have talked demographically about how Texas would be favorable to the Democrats in the long run because of the Latino vote. But if that's the way the Latino vote's heading, then maybe Texas won't be in play in the next 10 years or so.
I think that the Democratic Party need to look at the Latino vote and maybe not treat it as one ambiguous entity. There are Cuban Americans, there are Mexican Americans, there are Panamanians, there are Colombians, and they don't all have one uniform way of looking at the world. And so I think they probably need to spend the next 4 years just assessing that and how they address that.
I did an interview with an expert on this very topic very recently for Redaction. And we spoke about the demographic vote in this election. And what he said was exactly some of the words that you've just echoed, that you've just said, Richard, that the vote, the Latino vote, the minorities vote, it's so fragmented when you really look into it. It's not as easy to say the Latino vote goes Democrat, the Latino vote goes Republican. It's so much more detailed than that, even state by state. And what was really interesting, which maybe to get your thoughts on, was the actual migration within the states and how that is impacting where the votes go. So there's one study which showed that a lot of Californians who, when you look at the electoral map, heavily lean Democrat, because of the rising cost of living, have moved to other areas of the US, particularly in the South, particularly in Arizona, which is actually one of the states that Biden flipped. So I thought that was fascinating, how that demographic change, we actually saw that. And, and Georgia, what a story that is, Georgia.
Yeah, I tell you what, I mean, I obviously, Rich and I had this bet on over Georgia, though. I will say this, if somebody told me a couple of weeks before the election that Biden would win Georgia, but not North Carolina, I'd have laughed them out of the room.
Yeah. And equally, Biden wins Georgia and loses Florida. You'd only have to look at the prediction article that I wrote for Redaction a couple of weeks earlier that got both of those predictions correct. But going back to your previous point, Declan, talking about Georgia, I think we need to talk about the performance of Donald Trump in the suburbs. The fact that he lost a large swathe of the electorate there, and if you look at places like Maricopa County in Arizona, which is the sort of suburbs and the surrounds of Phoenix, a similar thing happened. And I did like to think of John McCain up there somewhere, looking down and thinking, "Goodness me, Arizona now has 2 Democratic senators and a Democratic state."
John McCain likes presidential candidates who win Arizona. That's just it.
He does.
He doesn't like losers in Arizona.
No, and he doesn't like Donald Trump at all.
I can't take credit for that joke. I'll just say that.
No, I've seen that before, but it definitely does ring true. So it's a very different electoral map, and it remains to be seen how it's going to be moving forward.
Well, one other state to bring up in that equation, of course, is Ohio, which it was the first time since 1960 that Ohio has voted for the losing candidate.
Yeah,
I think there may be a long-term trend here in which Ohio becomes more leaning towards the Republican column.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not too sure about the changing demographics of the state, but I think there's probably something to be said about Obama's ability to campaign successfully there. I do wonder if Ohio was fairly right-leaning anyway, but we just haven't noticed it until now, because obviously Obama's not on the ticket. I mean, obviously they voted for George Bush twice in 2000 and in 2004. So it very well could go redder than neighboring Pennsylvania and Michigan, Wisconsin.
James, I want to pick up on something you said earlier. You said it was closer than it should have been. What do you mean by that?
More than 200,000 dead Americans. That's what I mean by that. How do we think Trump's handling of the pandemic factored into this, and how did Trump manage to hold on to such a large share of the vote in spite of that?
I don't think as many people voted on pandemic issues as we perhaps gave them credit for. I think more people voted for the economy. I think if you looked at the numbers of who is better for the economy, Donald Trump tended to best Joe Biden by maybe 5 or so points. So I think on balance, people probably thought pandemic, economy, well, we'll hopefully have a vaccine soon. And I know that's terrible to say, but it does seem that that's how they've cast their vote. You're right. Obviously, yeah. Joe Biden still came out on top. But yeah, I mean, it shouldn't have been this close. If we were only voting on the pandemic, it would have been an electoral landslide, in my opinion.
I mean, I think that's I think even that much is a bit bold. I think that, even voting on the pandemic, there's a not insignificant portion of the Republican voter base that still see the coronavirus as either a hoax or a statistical anomaly.
Yeah.
Looking at each one of those deaths one at a time and saying, well, I mean, it's not anybody I know. 99.9% of people survive it.
Yeah. And also, if you looked at the campaign strategies of both of the candidates, you had Trump saying, it's going to be okay. We're rounding the corner. It's fine. We're doing well. He was trying to project this positivity in the case of the pandemic. Conversely, you had Biden, correctly, in my opinion, was saying, this is very serious. We need to listen to science. We need to wear a mask. But he was advocating for arguably reducing contact and making it a bit more difficult on a daily basis. So I think on that kind of shallow level, certain people will have been like, well, I'm going to vote for the president because he seems to be a lot more upbeat about the situation.
If the pandemic weren't such a big factor, then where was this Trump loss as opposed to it being a Biden win?
Well, I think he was so far behind anyway. I mean, if we take the pandemic out of the situation, Trump wins, right? But if not for the pandemic, I think it managed to swing enough voters, but maybe not as many as we thought. But also, I think there's something to be said about Joe Biden's broad appeal. Figures like Cindy McCain, who endorsed him in Arizona, other, members of the Lincoln Project who were Republicans who were very anti-Trump. I think he did carry a number of moderate Republican voters, and I think that did help him get across the line, especially in some of these key swing states.
I think that is a critical thing to bear in mind, is that Biden successfully managed to create a broad coalition strategy. I'll get onto this later in the podcast when we bring a UK comparison up.
Yeah.
But I think you're quite right. He managed to bring some moderate Republicans on side while simultaneously also keeping the left of the party on side.
Yeah.
That was critical. He managed to create a broad coalition.
And that's why you saw him successful in places like Georgia. If you look at the fact that now we have a runoff for both of the Georgia Senate seats, I would personally I'm going to hang my hat on this. I'd be very surprised if the Democrats win one of them. I think the US electorate is saying, right, we need some checks and balances here. We're going to take Trump out of the White House, but we're not going to flip the Senate. We're not going to give the Democrats complete control over this.
Plus, the Republican base will turn out even more.
Yeah.
Most likely.
Well, it's interesting. I saw some tweets earlier tonight from Kelly Loeffler, the senator running for re-election in Georgia, basically hanging her hat on Trump as much as she can, and certain people coming out and saying, well, why are you hanging your hat on the lame duck president, the loser of the election? And people rightly commented, you know what, it's her best hope, because there are enough enough of these base supporters that will turn out and support her to give Biden a check and a balance. And it remains to be seen how Biden governs as a result of that.
Plus, it's worth remembering that Trump still has a heck of a lot of support.
Yeah, and
we've seen the people out on the streets.
Yeah, they're not. Yeah, a million. Kayleigh McEnany said there were 1 million people marching for Trump. I'm not sure there was quite 1 million people. I mean, her and Sean Spicer need to have a heavy cup of something when it comes to estimating crowd sizes. But there was not an insignificant amount of people that marched in Washington D.C. And these people aren't going away. So Biden needs to figure out a way to kind of keep them happy. I have confidence for Biden. He's spent a number of years in the Senate going across party lines. I mean, I know we say it's old Washington politics, polarization, but you've got to remember how much Obama was despised by the Republicans. The Republicans don't despise Biden in the same kind of way. I think he is more likely to be able to get on with perhaps Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell on certain issues. So maybe certain things will get done.
Maybe. I mean, I think there may be another reason why the Republicans hate Obama. Let's face it.
Sure, of course, just bald-faced racism, of course, and that is the elephant in the room. But that being said, he was still unable to get a lot of his legislative program through because of an obstructive Congress. Look at Merrick Garland. Case in point, how many other presidents have successfully nominated a Supreme Court justice 9-10 months before an election and not even been given a hearing. So no, I think there will be a bit more goodwill from the Republicans, just especially when it comes to Senate, when it comes to cabinet appointments and various things. But then maybe I'm being the eternal optimist. Maybe gridlock will remain. Who knows?
I mean, I think that is a convenient segue. Actually, what do we think Biden's cabinet is going to look like? Because it does strike me that if the Republicans are going to hold the Senate, some progressive picks are probably not going to get through. For example, if Warren were one of the candidates for a cabinet position, which I would have said beforehand would have been likely, but as I think Biden will want to throw a bone to the progressives, but...
I think he will, but I think he's probably more going to go down the diversity route rather than the political spectrum route. I think you're going to see the Biden team touting, rather than, look, we've got members of the Democratic left, look, we've got Republicans. They're going to say, right, look how many women we've got, look how many people of color we've got. And I think they're going to try and bring those people on, bring the majority of the American people with them on a diversity platform rather than on a policy platform to moving forward, I think.
I think that this was pretty well represented by the way that we saw Biden and Kamala Harris using identity politics in their first speeches after the election results were called. We had both of them spending several minutes of their speeches talking about how they're family people and how important their family is to them. And I don't think that's a line of rhetoric that's going to sell with any Republicans, because let's face it, Biden's family are seen as a liability. As much as it was made up, the Hunter Biden allegations still sort of hang over him.
They are allegations, correctly or incorrectly. They're still baggage. You're absolutely right, that hang over Joe Biden.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that came through to me on Joe Biden's victory speech, I suppose we could say, was actually the word unity and being united, how he really wants to try and do that in an America which has become increasingly fragmented under the Trump administration, it seems. Yeah, I mean, we've alluded to that already. Biden needs a broad coalition. He needs to win those voters over. How does he do that, though? How does he win over people who perhaps look up to Trump as representing what they feel America should be? How does then Joe Biden try to win those voters over and say, actually, there's another way that we can go?
I mean, I think it's a fairly classic victory speech line for any politician, sort of, we're all going to come together now in spite of this election, I'm going to rule for all of you. This will be unity. I think it's a very vague platitude unless we actually get a concrete example of what that means.
I think. Sorry, no, you go, Mason.
I don't. Okay, so I'm obviously speaking from what I want. For what I want, from what I want to happen, but I don't think that Biden's unity platform is going to float, and I think that is something that people further left than him need to take advantage of. Biden is going to have failings. They're going to be big. They're going to be largely caused by instigators from the right of the party or from the Republicans, and yeah, so there's going to be a lot of issues he's going to face, and all of that is going to be used as ammunition in 2024. And that's why, we need more progressive and leftist people to be in there first, criticizing these mistakes and I guess controlling that narrative to make it clear that Biden isn't failing because he's a radical socialist. He's failing because he's a bland centrist who's being used as a sock puppet by the DNC.
But is there, I'm just going to jump in here, is there an issue with that, Mason, that if, I think it's a valid point, Biden's under a lot of pressure immediately, and things are going to go wrong, it happens. But if the left within the Democrats then start to attack Biden quite strongly, is there a danger that could undermine the whole victory then, and possibly risk a strong Republican Party in 2024 and a weak Democratic one?
So I have a few things to say. Firstly, I don't think Biden's on the ballot in 2024. Personally, he'll be 82 years old. I think he will be a one-term president. I think he'll probably do a Lyndon Johnson and just say he won't seek the party's nomination. I don't think he's going to resign. I think that would be ridiculous. But also, I think there's something to be said about the fact that the Trump team are being incredibly obstructive now. They're not allowing any formal transition to move forward. It's going to make it very hard for Biden to get things done in the first 100 days, which is arguably the most productive legislative period. But talking about, if people on the left, criticizing the Democratic Party, I think it does risk the Republicans coming through the middle. I mean, party unity is important. There is an unanswered question of where is the party unified? I think if you look at the Republican Party for the last 4 years, they were in lockstep behind Trump. Well, the Republican Party have largely stayed intact. I mean, I know Trump has been voted out, but they have made gains in the House. They've they've not lost the Senate, and they've managed to get the Supreme Court looking exactly how they wanted to. So I think there is definitely something to be seen about unity in some way. I don't have the answer.
There has to be an extent of unity, I agree. At the same time, there has to be a debate too.
Yes.
And this is politics. It doesn't get solved by just sitting around and having a polite conversation.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
And if I had the answer, I'd be...
Yeah.
Sorry.
What I'm going to say is that I think even if Biden demonstrates unity within the party, people are going to see the disunity from outside of it. Black Lives Matter are going to continue protesting well into a Biden presidency, and that's not something that he can resolve just by having a woman of color as his vice.
Absolutely. Pretending there's unity achieves nothing if there is actual disunity out there, and there are unresolved issues.
And unfortunately, the way the American system works is that, as a president, you really are quite hamstrung if you don't have the Senate.
Absolutely.
If the Senate is not the same party as you, it's incredibly hard to get anything done because the Senate control all of your appointments. Obviously any kind of Supreme Court picks, that you got and obviously progression of any legislation. And so when it comes to like looking back at like, well, has Biden got anything done? It's see how obstructive the Congress is going to be. But yeah, there's going to be a fight ahead. Now we've gotten rid of the orange man. We've talked about this. Got rid of the orange man, and now we can start talking about identity, about the Democratic Party as a whole.
What sort of issues then do you think Biden-Harris will seek to focus on? And for this one, I mean, let's maybe put COVID to one side, because it's an obvious one that they need to deal with urgently. Aside from that, what major issues do you think a Biden-Harris partnership are going to tackle?
Well, the economic consequences of COVID. I know you said don't talk about COVID, fair, but also the economic consequences of COVID. I think they're going to be, in some ways, a bit like Obama in his first term. He took office immediately after the GFC, and the global economy was moving in our direction. And I think Biden is quite lucky in the same way that the economy will recover, slowly or quickly. So he will be able to point to an upward trajectory. And I'd like you to point me to an election that wasn't won or lost on issues of the economy. So, if he can point to economic progress, reduction in unemployment, rises in GDP, and try to paint, and maybe that is a way to get more of a Trump voter on side, to paint it more of in a, rather than like the stock market's doing well and this is the only barometer I have for success, but like think about your hip pocket. Do you have more money now? Are you better off than you were 4 years ago, which is what Ronald Reagan said in 1984, and won with about 787 electoral votes, I think it was. So that could be a strategy to bring on those non-college educated white Rust Belt voters, which he's going to need in 4 years, or Kamala Harris is going to need in 4 years, or Pete Buttigieg, or Andrew Yang, or Elizabeth Warren.
Mason, I'm going to come to something you mentioned. You mentioned Black Lives Matter, the movement, which is going to. How do we see that changing going forward? I mean, of course, we look at the police brutality that we saw in the United States over the recent years, and I think it shocked a lot of us. Are we likely to see a quick change to that? Are we likely to see quick improvements?
I don't think we're likely to see anything quickly. Like Biden didn't shy away from acknowledging these issues, but he's definitely been hesitant to sort of say what it is that he wants to do about them. And without control of the Senate, there's going to be limits to what he can do about it.
Yeah.
So I think, go ahead.
I think it's a very double-edged sword. I think you're right. He does risk alienating a number of core voters if he starts talking about things like defund the police. I do think that obviously there's a lot that needs to be done with addressing these matters, Black Lives Matter and racial equality and police brutality, etc. Guns, Second Amendment. God, we could do a whole podcast on it. But I think you've got to take enough of the electorate with you, and I can see that. I think Biden's strategy is, at least thus far, slowly, incremental progress, rather than like, well, we're going to go all the way over here to the left, or we're going to go all the way over there to Trump on the right. I think maybe he's going to try something a bit slower, a bit more boring, but maybe boring is good.
I mean, when he was trying to court moderate Republicans, it's quite easy to see why he'd distance himself from the defund the police slogan, which,
yes.
I mean, even though I completely agree with the idea behind defund the police, I think there is a better way of selling that policy.
Yes. I think using the phrase defund is not a smart choice. You got to, if you thinking about the police, if you think back to like 9/11, right, and you think about New York's finest, you think about all these people that just ran into those buildings and just with complete disregard for their own life and just did everything that they could to save as many people as they could, and sadly many of them perished. They're a really valued member of American society, almost up there with veterans. You'd see a police officer, people would probably thank them for their service, just like you would somebody who's served a tour of Iraq or Afghanistan. So I think there's a line to be walked here, of saying, well, okay, we have an issue with this. Is it retraining? Is it changing some other kind of mechanism structurally within the police. But
I think demilitarize the police is a slogan I've heard that I think is an important one to push.
Because I think we do need to sort of recognize that, like if we go for the line of retrain the police, we round up all the police officers across the entire United States, we put them in one big room, and then we give them like a diversity seminar, they're going to tune out.
Of course they are, and
they're going to see it as liberal propaganda, and then they'll vote for Trump 2024.
It needs to be specific about if it's reform the police, what reform? It needs to be more specific. If it's retrain the police, retrain them how?
I want to pick up on your point on demilitarize the police, because obviously the Americans hold their military in massively high regard. Of course they do, but Americans don't want to see their own military on their own streets. You know, we saw this a few years ago when Trump was doing his best to try to get a military parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. AKA Russia, North Korea, blah blah blah. Americans don't want to see their own military at home. So I think if there's some way that they can draw that into the argument, it might have some success.
I think there could be some tactical ways of using the military comparison, because obviously America doesn't just sort of turn around and look the other way when a veteran goes postal and starts gunning down civilians. So that is something that it's very easy to create the argument we should hold the police accountable for the actions they do while on duty.
Yes.
We also, I think, another angle to approach it from is to look at it at a mental health perspective, rather than saying, all cops are bastards, cops are under a tremendous amount of pressure, and they need to have appropriate training to handle that and to de-escalate situations appropriately.
Yeah. Do you remember a few years ago, I think it was 2017 after the London Bridge attacks, Theresa May was criticised in this country for not providing enough funding to police, for paying police officers
and that was something Labour massively capitalised on in the election.
Yes, absolutely. So it is a factor that has broad-based political appeal. But I think that we maybe need to look at training. We need to look at the types of people that are perhaps going into law enforcement. But just remember the slogan that the police have, to protect and to serve, both of which are big sort of heartstring words in the American psyche.
I think if we were to round it up, we're going to expect nothing too big in terms of police reform from Biden.
No.
Yeah.
But then
you make an interesting point, Mason. So I'm just going to jump in. You make an interesting point, then, Mason, that this issue it's not just demilitarizing the police and taking that power away from them and giving them accountability. But you're right that there's also the other side of the argument that it's also telling people on perhaps the left or the far left that not all cops are bad. It's about convincing them and trying to pull both sides together to meet in the middle, rather than having both sides pushing away, which it seems it has been.
Yeah. And to our listeners, I will take this opportunity to plug a previous episode of our podcast. I think it's episode 15, where we talk about how the left can get better at optics, where we address a lot of these issues.
Yes. Yeah, maybe the answer is, look at the left and the far left. Why aren't these people becoming police officers? What is it about the police? The bringing people together means that you do want to have people from many different walks of life. In many different jobs, and that could be one of the solutions as well.
I think we do sort of need to recognize a sort of under less visible portion of Trump's voter base this election, which has been I'm going to say the white suburbanite wine moms who don't pay much attention to the news but panic whenever they hear about BLM breaking a window on the other side of the galaxy.
Yes.
And these are people that I don't think these people Biden needs to cater to, but they're people that Biden needs to at least play to optically.
Yes, and I think the Black Lives Matter movement do need to probably think about how they do this. I appreciate that I say this in a very privileged position. I'm a white middle class heterosexual male, so come on now. I'm sorry for making suggestions here, but I think looking at those optics, like we've got in the previous podcast episode, look at the optics of how this might be perceived from all people from all walks of life. Also, I think there's something to be said for, in 4 years' time, we don't know what the issues are going to be. We don't know. Maybe there'll be another foreign war. Maybe, there could be anything that we'll talk about. I mean, 4 years ago, we wouldn't have thought that Trump's re-election campaign would be all about a pandemic. Goodness me. So there are many unknowns, which we can't quite predict yet.
Yeah, I do want to sort of step in and defend, BLM for a bit and say that I do think that the majority of them have an amazing grasp of optics. There are so many videos where you see one person breaking windows or like prying bricks out of the street, and then the other protesters stop them, hand them over to the police, record them doing it, and try to make it as clear as possible that these people are not part of the protests.
Yes.
I think they do a very good job of separating the instigators from the protesters themselves.
And maybe then there's a role for us as journalists in the media to portray that more successfully. I don't disagree with you, Mason. I'm sure that sort of stuff does occur, but I think it needs to be broadcast in a more effective way into all four corners of the United States.
Absolutely.
Yeah. On foreign policy, Trump has had a tense relationship with different world leaders. Not least in China, North Korea, Iran. That's been boiling up over the past few years. Maybe a little plug here that the Redaction team, a lot of us are currently working on some foreign policy articles about how the US may respond now with the Biden administration to these different countries. So keep an eye out for that. Just to get some opinions though, how do we see foreign policy differing under Biden?
Well, a bit of a normalization, first and foremost. I don't think you're going to see any summits with the leader of North Korea in the next 4 years. But I think the biggest question actually is about trust. I think, you're going to see Biden rejoining the Paris Climate Accords. You're going to see, all of those things that were ripped up under Trump sort of redone. But I think there will be a few people in different countries who will say, well, you know what? I appreciate you, President Biden. I appreciate what you're saying. But how can I trust that in 4 years someone else, some demagogue, isn't going to be sat where you are now and is going to undermine everything that you're saying? So I think the biggest challenge for Biden, especially in the Western democracies, the members of the G7, our traditional friends, the UK, France, Germany, Canada, Australia, Japan, etc. How can he convince them that American foreign policy moving forward is going to be largely how it has always been, Republican or Democrat?
I'm curious you didn't mention Australia or New Zealand there. Is there a reason?
I said Australia,
Okay.
but only because, New Zealand, my home, I just wouldn't say is a massive world economy, especially compared to the United States.
And give it time.
Yeah.
Give it time. No, absolutely right. Yeah. And I don't want to receive any terrible comments about bad-mouthing Ardern's wonderful government. Just in terms of the relationship, New Zealand and the US have a fairly good relationship. It was strained in the 1980s because of New Zealand's nuclear-free stance, which, in my opinion, was great. They refused entry for a number of nuclear ships into New Zealand ports, and as a result, the ANZUS alliance was ripped up. But good on New Zealand for standing firm. I thoroughly agree with it. But yeah, getting back to the point, I think trust, long-term trust, is going to be a tough sell for a Biden administration.
Absolutely. We won't be seeing the same sort of brinkmanship as we saw between Kim Jong-un and Trump, and between Xi Jinping and Trump and the likes. At the same time, that doesn't mean, we may be seeing more conventional diplomacy. That doesn't mean there's going to be nothing bubbling below the surface, though.
Yeah.
I think that it's not just a comparison to Trump that we need to make here. I think we also need to look at a comparison to Obama, because America's got a lot less soft power than it did 4 years ago. I don't think it's going to be that effective trying to build it up now that America's no longer an uncontested global hegemon. There are other players on the stage now that need to be accounted for, and I think that's going to have to change how America interacts with China, how it interacts with Europe. It's going to change. It's going to change a lot.
Who are those other players on the stage, on the main stage?
Well, you've got. Sorry, no, you go, Mason.
I mean, China's the obvious one. Their economic power is just continuing to snowball. They've managed to get over the hump on COVID a lot faster than some other countries. And I think both of those things are going to sort of combine to create a much tougher time for America to exert its influence in Asia. In Europe, like the EU is currently having its own issues with Brexit and with the countries that are still struggling to get COVID under control. But at the same time, a combined Europe is still a very strong economic power, and that's something that Biden will have to play with.
I mean, that's going to be fascinating, isn't it, to see how a Joe Biden administration interacts with the EU and how it interacts with the UK.
That brings us on quite nicely to a point, doesn't it? Because this was something that Joe Biden tweeted on September the 16th. He said, "We can't allow the Good Friday Agreement that brought peace to Northern Ireland to become a casualty of Brexit. Any trade deal between the US and the UK must be contingent upon respect for the agreement and preventing the return of a hard border, period." What do we make of this?
I think that a free trade agreement is much less likely under Biden if the Good Friday Agreement isn't adhered to. I think we've seen certain departures at number 10 this week might make trade negotiations be slightly easier. But yeah, we can't be having a hard border on the island of Ireland. So
does anyone want to have a shot at for our non-British viewers explaining what the Good Friday Agreement is?
I wouldn't want to sell it short, but it's by and large the agreement that ended the troubles in Northern Ireland, which was a centuries-old struggle between Protestants and Catholics, and those who believed that Northern Ireland should be part of the United Kingdom or Northern Ireland should be part of the Republic of Ireland. I don't want to say any more than that.
I think that's a pretty good job. I think you've done well there.
It's a contentious topic, hence the tiptoeing.
Indeed. So, but there was a mechanism put in place in 1998, which has largely seen hostilities cease since. Largely.
Yeah, Mason, you were going to make a point.
I mean, it wasn't going to be anything big. It's just, over the past week, I have seen some very weird doctored photos going around trying to implicate Joe Biden as like some sort of IRA plant, which has been absolutely hilarious to watch develop.
I think, speaking of conspiracy theories, I do think we need to speak about this as well, about Trump's refusal to concede, and about the rhetoric around, fake voting and electoral fraud, and just how we see this transition period moving forward. What's going to happen? Trump's not going to go quietly, but what do people think? How are the next 11 weeks going to play out?
I actually want to broaden that a bit. I think we need an entire discussion on the entire breadth of QAnon and how it's entrenched itself in the American public. This is something that I've written about, but I think it's also something that has a much stronger electoral influence than even I stated then, because we talked about how the polls are off, and I think one factor of that, obviously not the only, there are a lot of different things that influence how polls are taken and how they can be made accurate or less accurate depending on how the data is handled. But I think it's very important to note that depending on who you believe, 20% of people believe in QAnon, and one of the main 20%. Things that I have seen, 20% believe or are receptible to believing it, I believe.
I believe
What's the source for that?
Yeah.
I would need. It would take me a couple of minutes to Google up the survey. I'll do that after I finish speaking here.
Okay. Just on the Trump point, because there's a couple of things here, isn't there? We've got QAnon, which I think is fair to look at, and also what Trump is going to do over the next few weeks, and how Biden is actually going to be inaugurated in January, and what's going to happen between then. There's so much. I mean, I don't know how we can predict that. It'll be really interesting to see if Trump, for example, I think if Trump announces that he wants to run again in 2024, that may be seen as some sort of concession, that may be read as that. Whether he will do that this early, I'm not sure.
I mean, I highly anticipate that if Trump does concede in any way, shape, or form, he will be announcing his candidacy for 2024 on the spot.
I completely disagree with you both, respectfully. I was watching an interview last night with Mary Trump, the niece of nephew. I'm sorry, Mary Trump. I'm quite tired. I have a newborn. On CNN. And the presenter put it to her and said, would Trump run again in 2024? He's constitutionally allowed to, etc. And she said, you know what? I don't think the president will ever put himself in a position again where he can lose as badly as he has. I know he would never admit that publicly, but Donald Trump doesn't lose in his own mind, right? So I just do not think that is he's going to make that risk. That's not to say that Donald Trump Jr. won't run in 2024 or someone who is similarly inclined, inspired by Trump, but I think probably, I don't think we're going to see Trump again. But you're right, in the next 11 weeks is going to be quite turbulent. I mean, you've got the Electoral College meet on December 14th, which is when they actually formally cast the votes for president. And it wouldn't surprise me if people from the Trump team try to convince specific state legislatures to send alternate slates of electors to Washington. You might see them trying to put pressure on the Pennsylvania state legislature or the Wisconsin or the Michigan state legislature. And then further than that, you've got these runoffs in January the 5th. And I think this is why you're seeing a lot of reluctance within a number of Republicans to come out and say President-elect Biden. It's because they need this base. They need this base to turn out one more time. So maybe it's going to be January 6th, which is when the new Congress do ratify the president and vice presidential candidates, that we start seeing some Republicans say, okay, yeah, President-elect Biden, and he's going to be our next president. But it's only the 14th of November. We've got quite a bit of time between now and then.
I think that is a point to raise, that I don't think Trump would possibly run again if he thought there was a serious chance he might lose the renomination. Here's the thing. I think there is a sizable portion of the Republican base that would still vote for him if he ran again. The question is how many obstacles the Republican Party establishment puts in his way.
Yeah, and I think it's going to, there are a lot of Republicans who will have an eye on 2024, who will probably be thinking, you know what, I'd love to run and I'd love to try to take that Trump base with me.
Can anyone seriously imagine that Mitt Romney would beat Trump if it came to those two in a primary?
I think Mitt Romney would probably beat Trump in a general.
You reckon?
In a general.
Yes. In a primary, though.
Yeah, primary. Certainly not. Not where it needs to. No. But equally, I think there'll be a number of people on the right of the Republican Party who are thinking, I'd love to run in 2024. But if Donald Trump was there as well, they're not going to want to make an enemy of Donald Trump, are they? Even 100%. In a primary field. So it remains to be seen. But I still believe that he's not going to want to put himself in a position to lose again. Imagine if he ran again and he lost again. Imagine how that would ruin his psyche. I mean, he's been asking for all these recounts.
But there's also probably a desire on his part to save face.
If you look at the way that he has conducted business through his whole life, he has cut and run when things got a bit hard.
True.
And in the business world, he's been able to do so by declaring bankruptcy and kind of moving forward to the next venture, right? Whether that's Trump vodka, Trump casinos. Bankrupting a casino is incredibly difficult. Literally, the point of a casino is to take money from people who come there. I just don't understand.
The house always wins.
The house, unless it's the Donald Trump casino. I just don't understand. But you see what I mean? So if you're looking at the way that he's conducting his business, if it's all gone, if the presidency is all gone, he's just going to turn to something else. I think he's going to turn to a media empire, and he's going to look to have this kind of kingmaker status within the Republican Party. Everybody's going to be courting his endorsement in 4 years' time. People are going to be, his Twitter feed's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah. Mason, do you want to give us some context on the QAnon stat?
Okay, so I was able to retrieve the polls that I was remembering. The YouGov polls. So about 50% of the Trump voter base have heard of QAnon, and of those, about 40% believe some version of a QAnon-derived conspiracy. About half of that believe the entirety of QAnon. So I think this is definitely something that is going to fester in the Republican Party for a long time. I think
this is something. Sorry.
Yeah. I think that, it's even possible to make a comparison to the influence of the Confederacy post-Civil War. This is something that is going to follow America for a long, long time. Both this and other movements derived from it, because, QAnon wasn't first. There was Pizzagate, there was the birther movement. There will always be a conspiratorial faction of the Republican Party, and it's going to grow in time, and it's going to grow in influence.
And I think as well that the fact that the internet has just given rise to all of this. Anybody with a computer, anybody with a laptop and a webcam can just get online and start spouting this. I mean, it can be used for good, as in the Redaction Politics podcast.
I was about to say, on that note, please subscribe.
Yes, of course. Please subscribe, like. But
Call
equally,
to action.
it can be used. It can be used for ill as well.
Yeah, I think that is also another point that we need to sort of pivot to. I think the Democratic Party needs to get better at online engagement. I think that, QAnon, even if we set the conspiracies aside, perfectly represents how the internet can be used to rally a voter base.
Yeah.
I think if the Democrats are able to achieve anything comparable over the next 4 years, then they'll be able to make gains in 2024.
I think the Obama administration revolutionized that back in 2008 when it came to raising money and turning voters out. But I think the Democratic Party has taken a step back a little bit. So I think, if you can bring that engagement back, maybe get some more of the Obama people back in who did this. I mean, they're probably old now. They're probably 35. But I say this as a 34-year-old. I absolutely agree with you, Mason.
I think the moment we all knew Obama was going to win a second term was that 10-second clip on YouTube of him trying to dunk a cookie into a mug of milk, discovering it was too big, and then saying, "Thanks, Obama."
Yeah.
That was when we knew he was getting 4 more years.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have to say though, I don't know what you guys think, and maybe you won't like this, but I do think that with Joe Biden, he just come across as a likable fellow. Like when I listen to him,
of course,
when he speaks, he's obviously older, and I think he looks older than Trump as well, in my view. And I think that comes across as almost like a sort of sage kind of wisdom kind of vibe.
He's done some hard work in his life.
He seems but he seems quite humble and quite just sort of down to earth. And obviously he's very well trained. He's a veteran, politician, but there's something likable about the guy.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I do think that, I think sometimes he has it and sometimes he just really absolutely does not, right? For every clip I've seen where he's, perfectly maneuvered his way through a situation, there's another one where he just completely stumbles and then falls flat on his face. The one that will always stick in my mind was a clip of I believe it was him giving a speech at some, I assume it was some sort of movement for people with disabilities, and just at some point, partway during the press shoot, he walks up to a child in a wheelchair and pets them on the face.
Yeah.
Like there's some sort of house pat.
And yet Trump can mock a disabled reporter publicly and not lose any votes. It's amazing how that can be contrasted. But you're right, Mason. You will remember that, and that's the one that we played over and over again on TV. And
moments like that are always more of a liability for centre-left politicians than they are for centre-right.
Yeah,
always on both sides of the Atlantic.
Absolutely, not just on both sides of the Atlantic, all around the world, I think.
Yeah.
But on Biden's sort of, we have seen times when he's been giving speeches when he's almost sort of stammered. He's almost struggled to get the words out, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe he did have a stammer when he was a child. Am I right in believing that?
Yes.
I
believe he does have a stammer. It does seem to have been exacerbated over the past year. I think that it is something that, with the right groups, can be played to his benefit, because I think that, there is something inspirational about somebody who has a speech defect being able to be so as eloquent as he is able to present himself over the day.
Channel his inner Winston Churchill or his inner King George VI.
Well, it just makes it more normal, doesn't it?
Everyone
has things that that aren't perfect about them, and for a politician to become president with that, it just makes him so much more relatable.
He's also got a good story. The fact that his children his wife sadly died, and his child in a car accident when he was about to be inaugurated as a senator, and how he became a single dad, and how he triumphed over adversity. And conversely, in Trump, you've got somebody who was given $1 million by his dad, and just kind of lambasted his way from failed business to failed business. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting few years ahead.
At the same time, politically active people can't get bogged down in that. We have to talk policy.
Yes, we do. But
obviously, electorally, it's important that people are able to sell themselves too.
Yeah.
And I suppose,
but the election's over now.
Yeah, absolutely. And here we pivot to governing. Governing's a lot less. Governing's not as sexy, but it's, of course not. But you have an ability to.
Well, it depends who does it.
Well, sure, but you have an ability to make more of a difference, don't you? Because
of course,
as a West Wing episode saying that I'm not a big fan of running for election. Why are you not a big fan of running? Because it takes away from helping. Takes away time from helping. So I think that's an important thing to remember, that this is why we elect these people, to try and make people's lives better. So
absolutely,
and hopefully we can hold them to account.
I think that's a good pivot back to what we were talking about the Good Friday Agreement and about Biden's stance on that. Because to give us some perspective, we talked about what the Good Friday Agreement is vaguely already. The controversy for our international viewers who aren't aware is that a potential exit from the EU could threaten the Irish peace process and could threaten the Good Friday Agreement, especially if there were a hard border put up on the island of Ireland in the event of a no-deal Brexit. What can Biden actually do beyond threatening to not provide a free trade agreement? What could he do to intervene in the run-up to that?
Well, he can put pressure on. I mean, he can make it pretty clear to the UK that it's not going to be acceptable under his administration, and the special relationship can be threatened. I know, especially on this side of the Atlantic, every occupant of Number 10 has been very keen, at least in recent times, to put their arm around whoever's in the White House. Whether you've got Tony Blair and George Bush, or you've got David Cameron and Barack Obama, and Johnson and Trump now. So I don't think you're going to see any different when Biden's in the White House. But I think it's important to remember that no deal Brexit's going to happen maybe the 31st of December. It's 21 days before Biden even gets inaugurated. So he's not going to be this savior of no deal Brexit. He's not going to come on in his big red, white, and blue horse and save the day for everybody.
Well, exactly.
Yeah, he does have that he does have the ear of the British Prime Minister, doesn't he, at all times? And whatever his views are on that, he has that influence which very few of us will have.
He does. And it's important as well, a lot of the Brexiteer argument has been, well, if we turn our back on Europe, it's okay because, we're going to have America. We're going to be able to make a free trade deal with America. And then you had Trump signaling that, Brexit was a good idea and, it'd be open to free trade, etc. And I'm hopeful that maybe there'll be a bit more of a pivot back towards sensibleness.
Yeah. Of course, one other prospect floated by some Brexiteers is that of CANZUK, the closer union of Canada, Australia, the UK, and New Zealand. But I believe we're going to be saving that for another podcast.
Yeah, and I'll just say one thing: as much as I would love to have freedom of movement between my country of birth and the country I live in, etc., and I think it would be great. I don't think it would be a good substitute. I think it could be a thing that we could have as well, but maybe not in place of.
Yeah. Shall we? We've talked about the election in the US. Shall we slightly move on to some stories in the UK this week, just to finish? Who wants to start?
2 words, Dominic Goings.
Let's give some context.
Okay, so where to begin?
Dominic Cummings was the was the architect of the Vote Leave campaign, and managed to make his way into into Boris Johnson's inner circle, chief strategist, advisor. Has not been without controversy throughout his entire political career. Just a few highlights from this year only. During lockdown, it was found out that he drove 250 miles from London to Durham, and then to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight, despite the fact that we weren't allowed to be travelling at all.
For international viewers, for some context there, London to Durham is almost the entire length of England.
Yes.
If you wish to get more details, open your search engine of preference and type in Cumgate.
No, for real, that's what was trending at the time.
Yeah, but more importantly, what everybody was calling for him to resign. Everyone apart from Conservative MPs, and he just was one rule for them and another for the rest of us. He's decided to leave now. So, it was very sad to see all of the Conservative MPs just line up behind Dominic Cummings. He certainly was very good at message discipline. I think he arguably won the 2019 general election for Boris Johnson by making him say "Get Brexit done" as over and over again as much as possible. But he appears to be going out the door.
Well, I mean, he literally did walk out the door, didn't he, with his with a little cardboard box, and there was a photographer there to take a photo.
Incredibly staged, let's face it. Dominic Cummings wanted that to happen.
Oh, of course
he knows how. Dominic Cummings knows how to manipulate the media.
I think even losing his job at this point in time was part of his plan, since I don't believe he planned to hang around beyond the end of this year. I expect he's gotten everything that he wants out of Johnson. Why would he stick around?
Yeah, and I don't see Johnson staying in the position very much longer. Especially now without Cummings.
I think he'll be gone by the end of next year.
I think sooner.
With Cummings, I think the issue is obviously he's unelected, and that's a big thing which I think frustrates a lot of people. The fact that he was, after the issue with lockdown, when he broke the rules for lockdown, and then he was in the Rose Garden, which is the garden at Downing Street where the Prime Minister lives, answering the press. The fact that we saw him leave the front door of 10 Downing Street, which is traditionally where we see the Prime Minister standing, it seems to me there's a power struggle going on there, a very visible one. And I think that frustrates a lot of people. Probably frustrates the Prime Minister. Obviously, I can't speak for him, but probably does frustrate him too to see that.
Yeah, but then the thing about Boris Johnson is he's not. I don't think he has no particular convictions, right? He just goes with whatever the political winds are, whichever way the political winds are blowing. And in a lot of ways, it's been successful for him. I mean, he wouldn't become Prime Minister without it. But I think, it's going to be interesting now to see what happens, that he doesn't have this militant advisor standing behind him, making sure that the right things are done and said at the right time.
Does it suggest a potential change of direction for the way in which the party, both the party and the government are going to go?
It may do.
I'm a bit more doubtful. I think the course of the government is set by more than one person. Not even the Prime Minister or the spin doctor controls everything, and there are still a lot of other people with the same allegiances, and they're still going to be aligning the party in the same direction for the same goals.
Yeah, and it will also remain to be seen that if you get rid of the Conservative boogeyman, will that help the Conservatives electorally, at least in the short term? Maybe it will. But then we're still 4 and a bit years away from the next general election. So anything that happens now is going to pale into insignificance in 4 years' time.
I mean, that is a good point, that Dominic Cummings is not a popular figure with the public, especially after the Barnard Castle debacle.
No, but on that point as well, I think one thing that people it seems to be forgotten in the sort of mainstream conversation about this is that he is an intelligent guy. He
for sure
didn't get to where he is without intelligence, without connections, and it does remain to be seen what he'll do after this. Where will he go? I'm sure there'll be a role for him somewhere, whether that's in the Conservative Party or elsewhere.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I'm trying to find the way to phrase this that doesn't make it sound like we're in some sort of political drama, but Cummings knows where the bodies are buried.
Yeah.
And all of those bodies are going to be a few years old by the time the next election comes around. So letting him go at this point might save out on a lot of future hurt, because any dirt that he could hypothetically drop, even if he hasn't already been brought into silence, is going to be largely irrelevant by the time it matters.
Yeah, and it remains to be seen. I mean, the Brexit negotiations are still ongoing. You know, there's still a chance there will be a deal with the EU before the 31st of December. I personally don't think there will be, but you know, it's interesting to see Cummings leave now. You know, 6 weeks before, and what does that signal? Does that signal he doesn't have any faith in the process anymore, or does that signal he's already got what he wants? He already believes there's going to be a no-deal Brexit. I mean, how this plays out even in the next few weeks.
Did Cummings jump, or was he pushed?
Well, there have been reports that he's quit, but there have also been reports that he was pushed. There were other reports that he's going to be working from home, quote, until the end of the year.
Yeah. There are just so many different things that could be at work here. You know, for all we know, on the outside, he has transferred his soul into a new mortal vessel and is using his old one as a fall guy.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, well, certainly going to be interesting. I mean, I think the government does seem to be in a little bit of turmoil at the moment, especially with Brexit is coming on. There's no deal yet. You know, we've had this sort of erupt this week. It's not a good look, is it, for the Conservatives at the moment?
And yet they're still ahead in certain polls and tied with Labour in other ones. So,
I mean, I think that does nicely. Once again, nicely lead us on to another point in this podcast, which was what can Keir Starmer learn from Joe Biden? Especially, like you say, I mean, the Conservatives are still ahead in the polls. There was a point at which Labour had caught up, but it looks like that time may be slipping now.
Broad-based appeal. 3 words.
Agreed.
Broad-based
I mean,
appeal.
Keir Starmer said that himself.
Yeah.
But this is a point I wanted to raise at the time, which is I think there is a difference between a broad coalition approach and a running to the centre approach.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think the thing that...
And I think the latter is what Keir Starmer more seems to be, from where I'm sitting, more looks like he may be headed, which I think would be a mistake. I mean, one thing that Joe Biden got right was that he kept the left on side.
Yeah.
I think the moral of the story for Starmer should be don't conduct some Stalinist purge where you line all of your political opponents up against a wall and then kick them out of your party.
Though I do think in the case of Jeremy Corbyn, he did need to make some visible statement about the anti-Semitism issue in the Labour Party.
Plus, let's face it, I mean, whatever your opinions on Jeremy Corbyn, his response to the EHRC report was quite tone-deaf, to put it mildly.
So while I completely agree, James, you know, broad-based appeal perhaps without running to the centre, I do think there are a couple of people probably need to be made examples of in that case, because anti-Semitism was a huge strain on the Labour Party on the doorstep in the last election.
Plus, even with a lot of people like myself who were largely on board on policy with what was proposed in 2017 and 2019, let's face it, Jeremy Corbyn was deeply unpopular with the public.
Yes.
Very toxic figure.
So if he can sell some of those similar policies, you know, a national education service, you know, there were a number of very popular increased funding for the NHS, you know, just things which need to be done to improve people's lives and livelihoods in this country. You know, the expansion of the middle class, and you know, talking to people in these industrial working class towns and making sure that they've got purpose and, you know, jobs and, you know, livelihoods.
Just to jump in a bit here, let's give a bit of context. So, James, you mentioned the EHRC report. Let's just, for people who are not familiar with it, let's just say a bit about that.
Okay, so the Equality and Human Rights Commission is what EHRC stands for. It's a body in the UK that, the clues in the name, it can investigate and regulate equalities and human rights issues in certain bodies. Recently, that was the Labour Party. In the Labour Party, the EHRC launched an investigation. Was it last year or the year before it announced it was launching its investigation? Anyway, its report was recently published, and it found that Labour had unlawfully discriminated against Jewish people. And obviously this has been a massive deal with the new leadership in place, I mean, a lot of the blame for the anti-Semitism crisis was placed at the feet of Jeremy Corbyn. And Keir Starmer is now, like you say, he's attempting to make an example, especially of Corbyn.
Yeah, and attempt to bring a whole bunch of people back on side. But then it is a risk, because there are a number of Labour voters who are very much aligned to Jeremy Corbyn on the left. And is he going to alienate them?
I mean,
I know a lot of
one criticism that
people
always got wheeled out against Corbyn supporters is that he seemed like some sort of cult of personality. And I don't think a lot of his supporters are doing themselves any favours in making their fight about Jeremy Corbyn himself, rather than about trying to lobby Starmer on policy.
Yes.
Mason, you were going to make a point?
Yeah, I think that one thing that's sort of gone uncovered by Starmer, that I know a lot of people have walked out of the party over, is the Labour leaks. There are a lot of people who have seen, the clipped WhatsApp conversations and the email records, and have a firm and entrenched belief that the Labour right is unified in a grand movement to expunge them and anyone who has leftist beliefs. And I think that is something that Starmer needs to cut off at the head. I think Starmer needs to take much stronger action on showing that, it isn't just a centrist Labour, it is a unified Labour.
Yes.
And that's the only way you win, with unity. I mean, if you look at the Conservative Party, for better or worse, they are they were, at least in 2019, unified, and they won a thumping majority.
I mean, the Conservative Party has always been very good at adapting and surviving. Well, I'd refer people regarding the Labour situation there to another previous episode of our podcast where we talked about the decline of the left. We did a small series on it, and one episode of which we talked about the Labour Party. And it's a point I raised, is that over the last couple of decades, that traditional Labour coalition has been fragmenting.
Yes. Do watch it.
Indeed.
I'm not going to spoil any more because I want you to go and watch it.
Yes. Okay. Well, we've talked about the US election today. We've had a bit of discussion on Dominic Cummings, the recent news. I think that's a good place for us to start winding down for today. So, thank you very much for tuning in, whether you're listening to the podcast or watching us on YouTube. It's always great to have you with us. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you have any opinions on what we've spoken about, how do you think Joe Biden's going to get on? Let us know. So that's it from me. I've been Declan Carey in this episode, and thank you very much from me and from our guests. And I'm sure we'll see you next time too. Cheers, guys.
Thanks for joining.